So, as it is the right time, let's begin. So, welcome to that webinar that will tell about how to manage a long crisis like the Covid-19. This is long crisis has some specificities that you must be aware of in order to manage it correctly. So during that webinar, you will be able to ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can see all the questions of everybody, so you can upvote one if you want to give more priority. I will answer the question at the end of the presentation. You can use the chat to communicate between you or with me. I have it in front of me. And you can also raise your hand if you want to attract my attention. Thank you in advance to keep the comments in the chat and the question in the question, because if you put a question in the chat, I may not see it and not be able to answer it. After the webinar, I will launch a poll and about how you feel about the webinar, and then the webinar anyway is recorded and it will be published on YouTube. You will receive a link and a link to download also the presentation. Then I will publish an article that will take all the ideas of the webinar and will present it. And you receive also a link to that article when it will be published. Well, first, are we in a long crisis? This is a question for most of the people. In the Covid-19, the epidemic management now enter in a new phase, the release of the lockdown and the restart of the economic activities. No population until now gained herd immunity, and new clusters of the epidemic is beginning to develop. So these are the symptoms that we are not finished with that epidemic. But we see also on the side, the habit of consumption get modified deeply. Because the clients are worrying about the future, they are worrying about getting out, so they don't go to the stores. We have seen, for example, in France, stores reopening and remain empty. This is a new way of living, ordering many things online, making your grocery purchase online because you don't want to be mixed with a lot of people inside a big store, and also a change of life because some time ago, before the Covid-19, well, taking a plane was something normal. You take a plane like you take a bus. Now we don't have anymore the air transport. Airplanes have been banned, and we learn how to meet, how to work remotely, much more remote, much more than before. So for sure, these are parts of habits that will remain in the population, in our way of living, and will change a lot of things. The activity stop was very sudden. In less than 2 weeks, we simply find ourselves inside a home without being able to exit. Now that we can exit again, the start seems to be very progressive. Most of the people who are forecasting a quick restart, it will not be the case. It will be very, very progressive and maybe very slow, in fact. We have no visibility about the end of the crisis. The end of the crisis is behind the horizon. We don't know when it will be. We only know that it's out of sight for the time being. Now it's adding up upon the sanitary risk, another kind of risk, which is the risk of social disturbance. Many people are jobless now. We have, in France, we are already forecasting that the social disturbance will begin in less than 1 month. People will be unhappy. They will be frightened about the future, and they will want to have some answers. So we speak a lot about resilience, business continuity, and most of the people use one word for the other. They are not the same. They are in fact completely different. Resilience is the ability of an organization to adapt to change, to adapt to a disaster, to survive. It's much wider than business continuity. Business continuity is only, it's important, but it's only in case of disaster. How do you ensure that you will go on delivering service even if it is at a degraded capacity? There are also two other concepts very important in this domain, which is risk management and continuous improvement. Continuous improvement is really at the center of the resilience, and we will develop this a little bit later. Example of crises are, for example, of classical crisis, the Dorian hurricane in Florida. It lasts 3 days. The recovery was 2 or 3 weeks, but they have every year. They are used to that. The tsunami in Japan in 2011, outside of Fukushima, is a classical crisis. They already had tsunamis. It destroys things, it kills people, but the life comes back after a while. The Yellow Jacket protest in France in 2019 was, for me, a classical crisis. Some people may argue that the protest lasts 1 year, but so it should be a long crisis. It was not a long crisis because it doesn't have deep implication in the society, in the civil society. The Yellow Jacket was making disturbance only on weekend, and most of the people have no issue. Simply, they didn't go on some place to make their purchase, and they go on some other place. So, except for the people who have restaurants or stores in Champs-Élysées, it was not such a big deal. It was not a game changer. A long crisis, most of the time, is a game changer. For example, Katrina hurricane in New Orleans. For some region of New Orleans, it was a complete game changer. Up to now, 15 years later, that part of the city has not been rebuilt. People didn't came back. Is still totally destroyed. Tsunami in Fukushima in 2011, especially in Fukushima. So we mixed at the same time a tsunami, then a nuclear accident. In the region of Fukushima, you still have a no-entry zone where people are not allowed to come back to their home because of the risk with the central. We have, in a long crisis, evidently COVID-19, and the big example of a long crisis, the Second World War. It lasted nearly 6 years, and it was a big way of life changer, a big game changer for the whole world. Now, let's see a little bit what are the characteristics between a classical crisis and a long crisis. A classical crisis has a duration which is mostly known. If you have an earthquake, you know that the event will last 2-3 hours, and then you will take 5 days for rescuing, and then 2 weeks to restart activities. If it is a storm, a hurricane, 3 days of shelter at home, and then 2 weeks to restart activities. The world as before will be back within weeks. There will be no change of habits, no change of the market. The habits of the client will not change. People will still go to their store making their groceries purchased. Nothing will be different. The main risk is activity interruption. This means if your activity is interrupted, if your servers are destroyed, are you able to restart? This is a main risk in a classical crisis. The company enter immediately in reactive mode and wait for the return of to normal. They don't have to adapt to a new reality or to a new way of doing business. And normally, let's hope, when you have a disaster, classical disaster, you don't have a second one immediately. On a long crisis, this is a completely different of animal. The duration of the crisis is unknown, but is always perceived as long. This means when we are, for example, now, we are unable to tell when this will end. We are not able to tell when we have a vaccine or when we have a treatment. We don't know when we will be able to meet other people normally. The world as before shall not even come back one day. Or when it will come back, it will be differently. We will not even recognizing it. Habits of client will change from the first day of the crisis. The crisis is so deep, immediately, is so frightening, even if it's not hurting so many people. Because if you look now, well, 2% of the population have been exposed to the virus. But 100% of the population is frightened about the consequence. And we will see other change. Along the time, people will change, new habits will come, will stay, new things will appear, new change, new way of doing things. The risk is not only activity interruption, but lack of adapting to the change. You can survive if you don't adapt to the change that will happen during the time of the crisis. You will not survive. The business will not survive. Business will be different if you don't do the business differently. You will not survive. You will not be there to see the end of the crisis. So the company has to enter into some kind of proactive mode when they will determine what are the changes that he expects that can see in his market and how to respond. Furthermore, there is a high probability of further disasters. I don't mean sanitary disaster. Well, if the epidemic of COVID lasts until the next winter, we may have an epidemic of flu with an epidemic of COVID. Okay, but it doesn't change so many things because the protection we have about the COVID will protect us from the flu. But we may have social disturbance, social unsettlement, people really going to poverty. And this may even bring conflicts. Because if you speak of social unsettlement and disturbance in evolved countries, is developed countries, often when you do the same, when you have the same kind of condition in a less developed country, it can go up to a conflict, up to an army conflict. So what are the steps that will be followed? First, happen a disaster. Then you enter in the phase of business continuity. Interruption of activity. The business continuity plans are activated and then you restart the activities. But to the difference of a classical crisis, you restart your activities while the risk is still here. You are not restarting the activity in a really secure time. You are starting having a risk of happening new things. And then you enter in the domain of resilience. You have the situation that is evolving in different directions. You have to determine what are the proactive actions that you will take in ensure your survival and your growth, that you keep your market, that you still work, and evaluate all those actions, if possible, before you have to implement, because implementing an action and waiting to see the result could be too late. If you make any mistake, it could backfire on you. And then when you are sure that your action are the right one, you have to implement the chosen action and get some feedback in order to verify that everything has not changed in the meantime and that you are still in the right direction. For that, you have to create scenarios. You need to have crisis scenarios. Why? Because this makes sense to the events. It's happening a lot of things. You have a lot of information. You can even stay the whole day in front of continuous news channels and you will have tons of information coming to you. Most of them you cannot link, but you want to get the full picture. You want to get a view of what is happening and where it can come, it can bring you. To make sense, you must make a full scenario to understand what is happening now and how this will bring the future, how this will this evolve in the future. You must anticipate. If you want to answer, to get ready, you must anticipate. Maybe you will anticipate things that will not happen. Maybe you will not anticipate things that will happen. But if you don't make that exercise, you never get ready. You are only in reactive mode and it will not work. It will not help you. You need to build the scenario with a very strong logic. The only thing you have now that can help you is logic, pure logic, mathematical logic. You know, the logic that you use when you solve a mathematical problem or a physics problem. This is how you have to do it. You should not exaggerate, neither pessimism, neither optimism. You are not making a scenario to make a film in Hollywood. It's not a catastrophe or disaster film in Hollywood. No, it's simply evaluating what could be the change, what could be the inflection points in the future that you have to look at in order to see if the events will go on one direction or another. For example, one inflection point, an example is, do we have a treatment? If we have a treatment, then the death toll will be lower. Then people will get more comfortable. Then people will begin to exit. They will be less afraid of the illness, and life will take more space in order to purchase, to consume, and the market will start again. The team creating the scenario, the people, or if it's one guy, that guy, or that team must not be involved in deciding what action will respond to that scenario. Because if you mix the two teams, you will only get a self-fulfilling prophecy. They will develop answers that will confirm the scenario. What you want is two antagonistic teams that will not really fight, but criticize the work of the other, criticize positively in order to get a tool that will help you survive. A very good tool to do this is the logical cause-tree effect. We have a perfect one coming from theory of constraint called current reality tree, and I will show you now one example. This is for a restaurant. This kind of tree you read from bottom up, and you read it like that. If we have new imposition for restaurants to reopen and the epidemic is still active, then the distance between clients will reduce the capacity. And when you express this like that, people cannot do anything else than telling you, oh, yeah, of course, it's obvious. Then we agree on that. So we go one step further. If the distance between clients reduces the capacity and people are afraid of contagion, then less clients are served in a shift. Oh, yeah, also, it's obvious. Then you go on creating your logic, and in that case, it's ended by wondering, well, does it really worth reopening? Or should we only throw the towel and abandoned? Maybe. So this is a scenario, how it should develop. What is the situation as you see today and how you see it in the future? Now, when you have that scenario, you build your action plan. Your action plan is based on that crisis scenario. You determine what action you can take to modify that scenario, and you will inject those decisions inside that scenario, that cause, effect, logic tree, and rebuild the logic in order to see what does it change. And then you evaluate, will the change be enough to change my behavior, to change my course of action, or will not be enough and I have to add other actions? You can develop alternate scenarios, adding one action, two action, three action, taking out one. You can use whatever you want. You make scenarios of response and you see if you can reach the conclusion that it's worth trying or not. And this is an example from the same cause to effect trees, and you see at the bottom right, the things are exactly the same. Then you inject one thing. This is especially for France, where maybe you don't know, but the restaurants outside of Paris are closed between 1:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. So one of the ideas, maybe we should open continuously during the day. And instead of doing two shifts, one for lunch, one for dinner, we can make four. We can serve continuously. So maybe on every shift, we will serve less people, but in fact, we will serve more shifts. So at the end, one will compensate the other. We can also, on another way, open the kitchen for online orders or develop a service where our own people will go and serve the dinner in the house of the people. And this means that you will make a complementary sales. Both together make better perspective, and in that case, you may conclude that reopening can be considered and may be positive. This is only by injecting some hypothesis or some action, you will, like in a domino game, the domino will turn and you will change the logic and it will change the outcome. And you don't need to spend any money to do that. You only have to use some gray matter, some thinking and some time. And by doing that, you can already test logically. It's true that when you apply that, maybe it will happen something you didn't forecast. Well, that happened. But at least you may be confident that you have found the major outcome of your action, and then that you already have tested your scenario, so you know how you can go further. When you have that plan, in parallel to that plan and those actions in order to rebuild your company, to rebuild your service, you must build your resilience. If you have not made, and most of the companies have not made, most of the companies speak of resilience, not knowing even what it is. They confund it with business continuity or only avoiding to lose job or to have a decrease of sales. This is not the same thing. Building a resilience is building the culture of your company in order to resist to the situation, to a disaster, in order to be able to overcome a disaster, to overcome a change, to make the change his own, and to adapt in order to exit from a disaster or from a change stronger and more able even to deliver a service. Only resilience can support a long-term vision. Why you should make a 5 years or 10 years plan if you are not able to survive to the next crisis or to adapt to the next change. You know, it's always strange for me when someone gives a 10 years warranty when I cannot even be sure that this company will be on the market in 6 months. This is totally crazy. The best principle of resilience are the following. You must have a shared vision and clarity of purpose. This means that your company must have a mission and some values. So you have the same vision in your company and clarity of what you try to achieve. You must understand and influence your context. And this for that you can use the scenarios. If you do the scenarios, you understand your context. And if you decide of action, you develop your scenario of action and you know if you can influence that context. Influencing context doesn't mean that you are a big lobbyist and you will be able to change laws. No, it means that you will be able to adapt to your context and be part of the future. Because by being part of the future, you influence the context. This comes from physics theories, where we say that looking at an experience modifies the experience. This is the same thing. Being part of the future will modify the future. So you will influence your context. You must have a leadership which is effective, human, empowered, this means distributed in your hierarchy, in your team, and discipline. Discipline, everybody must be aligned to the same goal. And this comes back to the first line, shared vision and clarity of purpose. If you don't have, you cannot have a disciplined leadership. You must have a culture which will be supportive of organizational resilience. People must know and must admit that they need to be resilient, that it worth resisting, that it worth being flexible at one time, be strong at other, to adapt, that is necessary to survive and to develop. And also the culture should be of continuous improvement. If you always want to improve your operation, you are wanting to adapt to new conditions. So you will be resilient. You must have the ability to anticipate and manage change. Also through the scenarios and the use of logic trees, you can do that. This is the tools to really manage to do that. You must also share information and knowledge. Companies that keep every information separated, information closed, and don't want to share that information never manage to survive. Because people confronted with a problem don't have the information to react. This is why you have to share knowledge, share information in order to improve the situation of everybody in your team, to improve their performance. And then you must have the right resources. This is very important. You must choose the right resources in your team and in your company. This is really one of the main things. Now, the tools that exist to manage crisis and resilience are those. We have now ISO standards. 22301 about business continuity, 22316 about resilience, 31000 about risk management. We have the theory of constraints, which is a theory of management really focused on continuous improvement. You have some kind of open organization. What I call open organization, it's a philosophy like open source in software. This means sharing knowledge, peer-to-peer collaboration, assistance, sharing information, sharing knowledge, working on the same goal, even on an ad hoc team. This is for me important. and I think it's a very good tool. I will explain more such tools in the webinar next week. We speak about building resilience with theory of constraints. As a conclusion, managing a long crisis needs a specific approach. It's not the same thing like managing a short or classical crisis. This is much broader than business continuity. Business continuity is only a little part of managing a long crisis. You need to anticipate the future change. You should not stop anticipating until the crisis is finished. And even after, you may see impact of the crisis developing along the time. For example, consequence of the Second World War, we even feel right now, because what is happening in the Eastern Europe country is coming from the Second World War and is not finished to move. You need a specific organization to ensure the resilience of the company. It's a big work to undertake to build resilience. It's not a small work, it's not the work of some days. It's really a big rethinking of your organization. And the crisis shall take a toll from the company that survive. Your company, if it becomes resilient and you have to face a long crisis, will not exit from that crisis as it entered. It may even exit stronger, and most of the time they exit stronger, but it will pay a toll anyway, because you will have to, it's a suffering path, it's a difficult steps, but it can help you seize new opportunities. So this is what I wanted to present you. And now, if you have some questions, I launch a poll if you want to answer, to tell me what you think about the webinar, if it was interesting you or not. And well, if you have questions, I will anyway in parallel tell you the question that I had when I made the same webinar in French. Someone asked me, at what moment from a crisis we understand that we're in a long crisis compared with a classical crisis? Most of the time, this happens when you restart activity immediately after the disaster. This is when really you can understand that you are in a long crisis compared with a short crisis. Other question that have been asked is, companies are very depending on financial markets. So aren't they reacting to the crisis depending on the market? And in fact, I think not. So I think that, well, to the contrary, many companies are using the crisis to try to influence the market. If you look at the pharmacy companies, they are trying to make an announcement and then to try to influence their stock value. So we have a question: what would companies do differently if it was possible to go back to the start of the COVID-19 crisis? I have two answers to that. The first answer is a little bit cynical. They should get rid of their staff in order to not have the burden of the salary during the stop of activity. It's very cynical, and fortunately they were not able to do that. The second answer that I think is much more positive, I would have built several scenarios of how to react and prepare my answer to be able to trigger the plan immediately after the event will happen. So this is, I think, how the company should have done. I think that neither one, neither the other happened, unfortunately. Despite the fact that we had the information from China. Because when we began to lock down in Europe, China was nearly releasing. So when in Europe we announced that, oh, we go for 2 weeks lockdown, well, how to believe that? Well, we already were at 2 months lockdown in China. But I guess that many people were not realizing. I made a poll when it was the beginning of the lockdown to around 60 people. 60 people were thinking that the crisis was to be 3 months. And then we go back to normal. Then, it was 2 weeks ago, I remade the poll with, again, 60 people, not exactly the same as they were in a webinar. And I asked them, look, what is your opinion now? Most of the people say, oh, 1 year. The crisis will be 1 year, and even 2, and even I had even one answer who say, oh, it will be the new normal. I guess that 1 year is because people can project themselves up to 1 year. They don't project themselves too far in the future. 1 year is one school cycle, is one cycle until holidays. So 1 year is normal. But now we see it as a long crisis. Before, they were seeing it as a short crisis where everything goes to normal. Now, people still didn't understand that the world may be well different. For example, there will be new opportunities. You will be able, as a company, to hire a talent in China, in Australia, even if you are in UK or in US. Before, you had to hire someone who will have to move his home to your office, close to your office. Now you will be able to hire people, well, 100 or 1,000 of kilometers from your office. And this is a big opportunity. Companies that will organize themselves to seize that opportunity will have access to much more talent than the others. So I hope that I answered to your question. Any other question? When I present this webinar to in French, I had one question that I thought was very interesting. It was about public research. Public research is a domain of activity that can really suffer for financial crisis or for a recession because they may not have the money simply to be able to sustain that activity and to go on their research. I think that what we see is a lot of people a lot of research will be reoriented, a lot of funds for research will be reoriented. Reoriented to what? First, everything which is linked with vaccine, treatment, healthcare will for sure have a lot of money. Whatever will be for environmental, new energy will have a lot of money. It's true that some other research, like sociology, maybe, or some other, maybe more literature, history, may have to struggle to find funding. But I don't think that the one who has funding already running now will be taken out now. But I think that for those, it will be more difficult to go on another step to get further funding. So the research, which is depending highly on government, will have to be, will suffer a reorientation of their aim. But on the other side, it seems that our governments now have found a way to generate money at a scale that was not existing up to now. And so there will be money even for research. Any other question? No? So I thank you very much to have to came and to assist to that webinar. I hope that I will see you in one of the next webinar, and I wish you a good evening and a good day. Thank you.